Hello everybody. My name is Deirdre Nocton and I am a member of the Library and Archive Committee who coordinate this RDS Library Speaker Series. Details of the RDS Library and Archive and its wide-ranging collections, including an online digital archive, and its activities can be found by visiting the RDS website at www.rds.ie. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to this event as part of the Library Series, and for which we are delighted to have RDS member Dr Beatrice Doran and journalist, author and former RT presenter Valerie Cox to discuss insights from Beatrice's most recent book, From the Grand Canal to the Dodder, Illustrious Lives. The book is a recent addition to a body of insightful works she has written. In it, she tells of the lives of some of the most fascinating people who once lived on the leafy roads and avenues of this area of the city of Dublin. A librarian by profession, Beatrice has worked in several libraries, including our own RDS, the University of Ulster, University College Cork, and the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, where she was library director. She's an associate and former president of the Library Association of Ireland. Local history and archaeology are interests of hers, and she was active in the Cork Historical and Archaeological Society as vice president, council member, and honorary organiser. Today, she is a member of the Ballsbridge, Donnybrook, and Sandymount Historical Society, the Irish Georgian Society, the Royal Society of Antiquities, and the RDS, in whose library some of her research for the book she will be discussing was undertaken. Please enjoy.
Hello, we're joined by Dr Beatrice Doran, who has just published her latest book, From the Grand Canal to the Dodder. You're very welcome, Beatrice, and congratulations on your new book. Can you take me back to the beginning and tell me where you got the idea, where you got the inspiration for this?
Well, I had written two books on Donnybrook, one called Donnybrook, A History, and the other called Donnybrook Then and Now. And when I had finished those books, I happened to be in a bookshop in Rathmines, and I found a book on the history of Rathmines, and that's how I started. I wrote to the publisher and asked them if they'd be interested in a book on Donnybrook, and they said they would. And I wrote several different chapters, and every one of them, I said to the publisher afterwards, could become a book in its own right. And he said, well, is there anything that interests you particularly? And I said, yes, the people of Donnybrook. And he said, why not extend it and include the people from Dublin 4? And I said, fine. So that's how it started. And I compiled a list of about 167 people. And it turned out that there wasn't enough material available on a lot of them. So I had to cut them back, and I ended up with 67 people who lived in the area that we now call Dublin 4.
Beatrice, I'm wondering about this particular area because it seems to have more than its fair share of historical figures and celebrities.
Yes, it is interesting, but I think if you went to the north side of the city too, or Clontarf or somewhere like that, that a lot of people would, would be very interesting and could be written up as well. But I suppose the south side of the city developed at the late 19th century. It began when the Earl of Kildare moved his private residence to what in fact is now Leinster House and the original home of the RDS. And he said that the people would follow him from the north side, and they did. And they moved into the beautiful houses on lovely roads that are now known as Dublin 4.
Can I take you back even further, Beatrice, because you and I share an alma mater, Dominican Convent, Muckross Park. And what are your recollections of that? Do you remember when you started school?
Oh, I do, and it's a very long time ago, and we absolutely loved Muckross. I started at 5 and I left at 17. So there was an awful lot in between in relation to Muckross. It was just a wonderful school. There were great teachers. I remember Mother Eamon in the junior school and Sister Bernadette, who prepared us for First Communion. Miss McAllister read us The Wind in the Willows. I can still hear her reading it to this day. then you went into the senior school, and it was a great hockey school. And I played hockey, and I ended up as vice captain of hockey with Lorraine O'Reilly, who was the captain and went on to be a hockey international. Lorraine was one of the triplets who were in my class at school, and I'm still friendly with them to this very day. And Valerie Barry was on our team as well, and she was inaugurated into the Irish Hockey Hall of Fame recently, and like you, was a president of the Past Pupils Union, as I was in the centenary year.
I was just going to say that, Beatrice. And also a few years ago, when the Past Pupils Union was 100 years old, the oldest girls' Past Pupils Union in the country, you were very involved in the centenary book, and you wrote a large chunk of it.
Well, I wrote a chapter on the Muckross Musical and Dramatic Society. Muckross was a great school for music, and we did operas and, you know, enjoyed them very, very much. And I played Ruth in the Pirates of Penzance, and then I joined the Past Pupils Musical Society, and I played Ruth in the, I played Lady Jane in Patience. And then I moved from Dublin and sort of lost track of the Musical Society. But I was delighted when you asked me to write, you were the editor of the book, when you asked me to write the history of the Musical Society, which I did.
I want to pick your brains a bit about writing, because the actual process of writing, I know many people are interested in this. Where do you actually do your writing?
Well, I'm a librarian by profession, so I've always been very comfortable working in libraries and archives. And when I was doing the MBA, I used the library in the Smurfit Business School quite a lot. And I had an alumni card for UCD, so I was able to use the library, the James Joyce Library, and I'd use the library in Richview, which is the architectural library. But mostly I used the library in Smurfit out in Blackrock.
You were quite privileged, Beatrice, to have access to all these wonderful, you were quite privileged.
Oh, absolutely.
All these wonderful libraries.
Yes, absolutely. Well, you know, I think Trinity have the same thing. If you have an alumni card, you can use the facilities of the library, which is wonderful.
Now, Beatrice, a lot of people will be watching this and they might think they have a book inside them. Have you any tips for aspiring writers?
Oh, I think you really want to, I can only talk about nonfiction. I think you have to be very thorough in your research. I've never written fiction, and I'm not sure I would be able to. I've never tried, but I'm sure there's a lot of research to be done as well, depending on what period people write books in, etc. And the availability of, I mean, I have quite a collection of local history books, for example, and I found them very, very useful when I was looking for people in particular areas. And inevitably there would be a chapter which would be about the sort of famous people that lived in the area. So that's worked out quite well for me.
So have you got some sort of a fascination with famous people?
Well, you could ask that, but I don't think I have really. I was fascinated by the unusual people that I never heard of that lived in an area that I grew up in. I mean, I didn't live here all the time. I lived in Coleraine and I lived in Cork for 14 years. So, you know.
Beatrice, will we now meet some of the people in your book?
Yes, absolutely delighted to. I thought I'd like to talk about Mary Aikenhead, whom I had no idea. She came from Cork and she was the foundress of the Irish Sisters of Charity. She had trained as a nun in the Bar Convent in Yorkshire. And she founded St. Vincent's Hospital on St. Stephen's Green initially. And then eventually in 1970, it moved out to Elm Park on the Merrion Road. And that was actually the original home of Elm Park Golf and Sports Club. The ground and the house were all called Elm Park. And the next person I thought I'd mention was Reg Armstrong, who was an international motorbike rider. And he won all the famous motorbike races in the Isle of Man. And he also rode internationally for all the very large teams. And he came from Rathfarnham Park, and he was educated at the high school. And he lived most of his life in a house called Inchinapa House in County Wicklow. And unfortunately, he was killed very young. He was only in his 50s, and he's buried in the cemetery out in Enniskerry in County Wicklow. And the next person I thought I'd mention from the book was Spranger Barry, who's a wonderful actor in the 18th century. He he was the favourite of one of the Prince of Wales, and in fact was the Prince of Wales suggested that he should take dancing lessons from the royal family's dancing master. But he was a great rival to David Garrick on the London stage, but he founded two theatres, one in Dublin and one in Cork, but he was a poor businessman, so they didn't survive. But he married, his second wife was an actress called Anne Street, and the extraordinary thing I found out about him was he's actually buried in Westminster Abbey, and so is his wife, Anne Street. She was a great actress too. I thought I'd like to talk a bit about Beatrice Bean, who's always been completely overshadowed by her husband. I had no idea that she was actually a very good artist herself, that she illustrated one of his books, Hold Your Hour and Have Another, and worked for a number of years in the National Museum as a botanical assistant. And she had studied abroad in Italy for a number of years as well. And I've been in touch with her daughter, who lives in England, and she was actually born just shortly after her father died. But Beatrice Bean lived on 5 Anglesey Road in Donnybrook, or it can be Bowles Bridge if you like. And then I thought I'd mention John Boyd Dunlop. I had no idea, first of all, that he was a vet, and he invented the pneumatic tire, and of course, ultimately Dunlop's the big company, and British by birth, and he had moved to Northern Ireland, and his young son Johnny was complaining about the tricycle that he had, and all the bumps on the road and how terrible it was. So it was he who invented the pneumatic tire, and he moved to Dublin, and he lived most of his life in 46 Aylesbury Road, and that is now the residence of the Belgian ambassador. I had never heard of Sophie Bryant at all. She was a brilliant mathematician. She grew up in Sandymount, but her father was a clergyman, and she actually married at the age of 19 to a gentleman who was 10 or 15 years older than her, and he had poor health and he died within the year, and she never remarried. But she became quite an educationalist, and she was headmistress of the North London Collegiate School for Girls. She succeeded Miss Frances Butt, who was the founder of that school, and she also worked with Miss Butt and Miss Beale to get teaching accepted in Cambridge University at Hughes Hall in particular. And she was also, never forgot she was Irish, and she became madly interested in what was happening in Ireland and joined the suffragette movement, spoke at suffragette movements in Ireland, and she also supported Gladstone's Home Rule for Ireland, and she spoke at rallies in England and in Ireland in relation to that. And in her middle age, she wrote history books about Ireland, but she was also, for the time, she was very sporty. And she actually climbed the Matterhorn. She was a great mountaineer, and she climbed the Matterhorn twice. And she had a sad end. She was on holiday in Switzerland, and she didn't come back to her accommodation. And they found her body 2 weeks later on the side of a mountain, which might have been, I suppose, what she would have liked herself, one way of going. And Abrahamcollis, if you fall and break your wrist, the chances are the doctor will tell you that you've had Collis fracture. And Professor Abrahamcollis was professor of anatomy and surgery at the College of Surgeons, and he also was worked at the Old Meath Hospital with William Stokes, which was a great centre for teaching and learning for the medical profession in the 19th century. And he lived on the Slorgan Road in a place called Donnybrook Cottage. And what you see underneath there are the typical, what would you say, the typical instruments used by surgeons in the 19th century. Just take a look at that saw. Frighten the life out of you, wouldn't it? And then Frankie Burns. Frankie lived in a house called Dunbar on Brookvale Road. And she had a sad life, but she was a highly successful public relations consultant, and she's the first woman in Ireland to have her own public relations company. She was brought up in Leeson Park, and she was educated by the Loreto nuns at Loreto Abbey, and she lived with her sister all her life. she got a contract with Jacob's Biscuits, and I certainly remember coming home from school and listening to the program Dear Frankie on RTE, which went on for quite a number of years. And the sad thing about it was she was solving all the emotional problems of half the population of Ireland, I think. And in actual fact, she had a very sad life herself. And, you know, that she actually had a daughter whom she met years later, but she had a very sad life, Frankie Byrne. And then Sir Robert came. He was the first president of Queen's College in Cork, and he lived in a beautiful house, number 2 Wellington Road. I was out for a walk recently, and we went along to number 2 Wellington Road to have a look at it. He was actually a chemist by profession and had always a great interest in the industrial resources of Ireland. And he wrote a famous book in the 19th century called Ireland's Industrial Resources. But the interesting thing about him, he tried to commute, and did for a number of years, from Dublin to Cork. He based his family in Killiney, and he would travel down to Cork as president of Queen's. And the interesting thing is, one of the professors, he was inclined to interfere with the courses and what people were teaching. And one of the professors was George Boole, the famous professor of mathematics in Cork, famous of Boolean logic fame. And he complained bitterly about Sir Robert Kane. And anyhow, apparently, Kane eventually had to go and live in Cork for a number of years. And when he came back to Dublin in his retirement, he was very active in the Royal Irish Academy. St. Conleth's College, Kevin Kelleher was headmaster for I don't know how many years, and he died in 2016 at the age of, in his 90s. He grew up in Drumcondra, and he went to UCD, and he became a teacher, and he joined St. Conleth's College and eventually rose to the position of headmaster, which he held for quite a number of years. St. Conleth's is a private Catholic school which was founded by Bernard Shepherd, and his wife was a great help to him in running the school. And after he died, Kevin Kelleher actually married Bernard Shepherd's widow, and they had a very happy life together, and they had a daughter called Anne, and Anne is now the CEO of St. Conleth's College. And it's a well-known school, and several Dublin families, indeed including my own, I have an association with St. Conleth's College. My grandnephew is the 3rd member of his mother's family to attend St. Conleth's. And Sarah Purcell was a wonderful artist and portrait painter. She lived in a house called Mespel House, which is no longer there. But the house, Mespel House, had been built for an Irish doctor from Cork called Barry. And it had magnificent stucco work ceilings. And when the house was knocked down to build Mespel Flats, the part of the ceilings were transferred to Áras an Uachtaráin and to the Department of, I think, Foreign Affairs, if I remember correctly. But Sarah Purcell came from a very wealthy Anglo-Irish family, and she had been educated in Switzerland, so she and her sister spoke fluent French. And she was a superb portrait painter, and she said herself, having done the sisters from Sligo, which now stands, this painting of the 2 sisters stands in it was Constance Markovich, and her sister is in the Merrion Hotel in Dublin. She said she got huge commissions from British aristocracy to paint their paintings. And in fact, she jokingly said that she went through the British aristocracy like measles. But she was also very generous, and very generous to other painters. And she also had soirees or afternoons in her house, Mespel House, where the general literati and painters, etc., would assemble, and there would be tea and coffee served, no alcohol, I think. And she also set up on Tour Glynna, which was a stained glass artist school, and people like Michael Healy and Evie Hone were trained in that school. And then there's George Rowe. Alderman George Rowe succeeded Daniel O'Connell as Lord Mayor of Dublin, and that's his home at Nutley. Nutley House and grounds are now the home of Ellen Park Golf and Sports Club. And the house was probably designed by the father and son, Richard and, I can't think of his name now. Anyhow, very well-known Irish architects of the previous century. and the grounds. And there's beautiful balustrade and the fountain and all the rest of it. And you can see on the right, there are statues in a sort of alcove, and they all date from the time Ninian Niven, who was the director of the Botanic Gardens, from the time he designed the gardens for George Rowe. The main entrance to the house was on the Stillorgan Road, and eventually later owners sold off land, and the houses in Nutley Park and also on the Stillorgan Road are now there. But George Rowe succeeded Daniel O'Connell as Lord Mayor of Dublin. He was also chairman of the Great Industrial Exhibition of 1853, which was sponsored by William Dargan, who built the first railway from Dublin to Dunleary. And George Rowe entertained people here. I have come across articles where it says, the Lord Lieutenant was coming for dinner or for a reception, and that there were 2 regimental bands playing on that lawn that you can see there. And I think I've given you some kind of flavour of the people that are in the book. I hope you will enjoy it, and you'll read an awful lot more than I can possibly tell you in this short interview.
My goodness.
Thank you very much.
I don't know how to start. But you've got the most extraordinary stories about everyone. And a few that really appeal to me, if I can mention them. Agnes Burnell, the cabaret artist. I loved, excuse me, I loved the story. She was born in Berlin, obviously, and came to Ireland. And her first husband was Desmond Leslie of Castle Leslie fame. And he was trying to renovate the castle and raise money. And she actually started a cottage industry, making crochet goods and knitwear. And she had a very famous model, didn't she?
She did indeed. Mary Robinson was one of her models.
Mary Robinson, our former president.
The president, yes.
The other story I loved was Frederick May, because Frederick May had a very tough life. He was a great composer. I mean, I still can almost hum his Spring Nocturne. And in fact, on the anniversary of his death in 2011, RTE released 5 CDs of his work. Yes. But there's an interesting story you have in your book that he was very ill and he spent a long time, I think, in Grangegorman. And Garrick de Brún of Lugalaw fame and, of course, Cladder Records went out to the hospital and he took him out of Grangegorman and he tried to rehabilitate him. I thought that was a lovely story.
Yes, indeed. Yes, he had a very sad life, really, very sad life.
And the other stories I liked were the love stories. And of course, you talked there about W.B. Yeats living in the area. And you've got details of the two great loves of his life, Maud Gonne MacBride and Maud's daughter, Isolde. And you tell the story of how Maud went to France and she had her son, George, with Lucien de Millevoye. And George died tragically very young. But she was told that you could reincarnate an infant soul by conceiving another child in the crypt. And that's what she did.
Yeah, well, quite extraordinary, quite extraordinary. And I think the sad thing too was she always kept his little booties. And when she died, or before she died, she asked that George's booties would be buried with her, and they were, as I understand it.
And of course, Patrick Kavanagh. I mean, for me, he epitomizes the whole area, really, because he was the one who went and sat on the corner of the Grand Canal, and there's a seat dedicated to him there.
That's
and
right.
Of course, his lovely poem that I think it's a legend, it'll live on forever. On Raglan Road of an autumn day, I saw her first and knew that her dark hair would weave a snare that I might one day rue. And we can almost hear Luke Kelly singing it, can't we?
Yes, indeed. Very popular. I've been trying to play it on the piano recently.
And did you succeed?
Only up to a point.
Beatrice, I have one very important question for you. Quo vadis, where do we go from here? What's next?
Well, I've actually been very busy because I'm a member of Ellen Park Golf Club, and we're working on a centenary history, and I've just written a chapter for the book on the history of Nutley, from the time of George Rowe right down to 1936, when Ellen Park moved to Nutley.
So that's your next
kept me busy. But I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that, there's another book in it what you would call it this time, I'm not sure, but there are still an incredible number of people that I have on my list that one could write about.
Well, I sincerely hope that our chat this afternoon has given our viewers an idea of this book, From the Grand Canal to the Dodder, Illustrious Lives, Beatrice Doran. It's a great read and it's on sale now in all bookshops and also as an ebook. Beatrice, I want to thank you very much for joining us today and giving us the wisdom of the content of your book. And I want to thank all our viewers too. And I hope you've come away from this, as I have done, with a lot more knowledge about the area and all the inside chat and gossip on the people involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valerie.